What does this mean for us right now? For Canadians in this room and for others who are following the press in this election and who may recognize this trend in your own countries. The debate about the right of women to wear the niqab in citizenship ceremonies, women who were likely refugees when they first came to our country, makes this point absolutely clear. Who is the we? And I'm not talking about political parties and positions here. But who is the we that is concerned about women wearing the niqab in citizenship ceremonies? And how does talking about us, Canadians, in these debates produce our sense of belonging in the very same breath that we produce the foreigner? It's this dynamic that I think is at play when some parents concerned about what teaching to intellectual diversity in the classroom might mean for their normal sons and daughters, or usually gifted sons and daughters, who surely have a citizenship right to the best possible quality education. It's also the same dynamic when it comes to the exercise of legal capacity in Canada and other countries around the world. British Columbia has made huge strides through the Representation Agreement Act, though niggling kind of safeguard issues and low uptake aside. It's not the case for most other parts of the country. Governments are holding on tightly to a strict definition of who it is that is going to be recognized to have legal power, personhood, and agency in their own lives. It is people who, with supports and accommodations, as might be needed, are able to understand and appreciate on their own the nature and consequences of decision. Of a decision. And as we see reforms in Canada and legislative proposals in countries around the world for reforming guardianship and introduction of supported decision-making and co-decision-making, this boundary of defining an us and a them has a really tenacious hold, even though we might permit it to become a little more porous. That boundary clearly produces a we who belong in communities and conduct our daily affairs with the freedom of contract and the authority to direct our own lives, whether through informed consent or by other means. At the same time, it solidifies a them who can't. What is passing as supported decision-making in most jurisdictions in Canada and in law reform proposals we're seeing around the world keep this boundary firmly in place. And why? I think it's because, as Etienne Balibar says, we have a deep need to represent ourselves to ourselves and to others as belonging. And one of the most powerful currencies for doing that is the cognitive ability to direct our own lives and to present ourselves as reasoned beings to others. The reason being that law, medicine, ethics keeps telling us we need to be if we're going to hold on to our ticket to inclusion. And the only way to convince ourselves that we're cognitively able and deserving of citizenship access on these terms is to define the foreigners that don't measure up, right? That growing group of people with intellectual and cognitive and psychosocial disabilities, and to establish the rules of exception to this otherwise inalienable and basic right of citizenship, the right to legal capacity. So I want to suggest that if we don't solve this issue of the legal and cultural state of exception for people that we essentially deem to be cognitive foreigners in our communities, in our midst, our designs for individualized funding and planning and personalized support will become technologies that have little hope of living up to their liberating potential. We may put them into place, but they'll lose their potential as funding agreements, for example, get rolled up for administrative purposes. We must, I think, much more fundamentally redraw the boundary in our communities about who actually belongs, who's part of this we in our communities that exercise legal agency over their own lives. Much more fundamentally than governments and legal thinkers have been willing or able to do. And if we don't, I actually think we breed a growing threat to our democracy. Because the we who belongs on the traditional, on those cognitive terms, and those who don't, well, the we who belongs is becoming proportionately smaller. with the aging of the population? What will we do with this growing group of cognitive foreigners in our midst as they remove, or as we remove, their right to legal agency? A couple of things, I think, are going to happen. I mean, if current stats are any indicator, the core of cognitive foreigners, including people with intellectual, cognitive, or psychosocial disabilities, will likely to continue to be victimized. They are now at a rate of 3 to 4 times the national average. And as their proportion in the population increases, it's hard to imagine that the rate of victimization will do anything but go up. What else? What else do we do? We remove the foreigners from the voters' registration list in growing numbers on the basis of unfitness to vote. And we also probably go to court to argue against the restrictions the Supreme Court introduced in its legalization of assisted suicide in the Carter case. And we go to court to, and the ruling said the rule of exclusion was you had to meet that usual test of legal capacity. But I think as this growing group of cognitive foreigners we find in our midst, I think we'll be going to the court again to argue that there's a violation in equality rights under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and probably Article 12 of the UN Convention, to deny persons access to the benefit under the law that legalizing assisted suicide is meant to bring. It will be discrimination on the basis of mental or cognitive disability against someone who otherwise meets all the criteria. And Annette Corriveau, the mom who wanted to euthanize her 2 significantly disabled sons, will have the legal authority to do so on the basis of equality rights. And the law in Quebec already provides for this. For substitute decision makers to authorize assisted suicide on the basis of advance directives. And the public and political pressure is going to mount to do this. Let's look at a couple of the figures. There's currently about 260,000 deaths per year in Canada. In 20 years, that's going to be it's going to be up to 425 deaths per year by 2036. Given the rapid increase in rates of dementia, currently about 500,000 Canadians have dementia. By 2038, it's going to be over 1 million. And at that point, every year, there'll be 250,000 new cases diagnosed. And this group will be one part of a much larger group with neurological conditions, ALS, Alzheimer's, traumatic brain injury, a group that's also rapidly growing. And from the data, we also know, and as this group becomes increasingly institutionalized, that quality of life in long-term care facilities leaves much to be desired. 40% of seniors in long-term residential care in this country have indicators of depression. So what will we do with this mass of cognitive foreigners in a period when they become a dominant population, holders of the largest pool of wealth for intergenerational transfer that we've ever seen, spending more and more of their money on low-wage foreign workers when it could be going to their grandchildren's education, in addition to the massive expenditure on publicly funded healthcare and community supports. Am I exaggerating? And I'm going to bring it to a close. But am I exaggerating? I don't think so, if you look at the rates of elder abuse now that we're seeing, with financial abuse being the most common. What if we fully individualize dollars and supports by that point? First of all, there won't be nearly enough to go around in the anticipated political climate for that growing number of cognitive foreigners. At least that's what we'll think. Or maybe that's what they will think, because by then me and many of us in this room will become cognitive foreigners in our own communities. I paint a pretty dark picture, I realize. But when we look at the slippery slope that's already begun in Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands when it comes to assisted suicide, and we place that up against the coming demographics in our own country, in a period where communities are already experiencing growing foreignness, it's hard to feel very optimistic. Can we be successful in building a sustained and mobilized constituency for self-determination of this growing group of us? Will we be able to push back against a wave of xenophobia against those foreigners? I think it's imperative that we figure out how to do this and that we get clear about our political claims. And I think it's a very simple claim, that we refuse the very notion, the very idea of cognitive foreigners in our communities. This means fundamentally rejecting the boundary that law and moral philosophy has imposed upon us about who's going to be considered to be a full legal agent and who is not. I think we have to name this claim more clearly than we have ever before and join up with others who are also at risk of being victims of its logic. We absolutely reject that cognitive ability is the ticket to belonging. And we demand a legal system and forms of community access that respect that claim. We refuse to make people foreigners in their own communities, whether by virtue of their refugee status or their cognitive abilities or other differences. I was going to reflect, but I think I've run out of time, on my own journey to coming to an understanding of the importance of redrawing this boundary. As I began my time in this movement with the looking at the Community Living Society, which had grown from the Woodlands Parents Group, and their efforts to bring people with intellectual disabilities out of the Woodlands School, and imagined individualized funding and personal support as the way to do it. And those remarkable experiences I had sitting in the living rooms of individuals and families and their networks as they demonstrated to me that work of interpreting the will and preferences and desires of people who would otherwise be completely cognitive foreigners in their own communities. In fact, they were, which is why they were forced into the institution in the first place. What they demonstrated to me, and people at that time were profound mentors for me, Joe Dickey, Jackie Maniego, and some of the brokers who helped make that happen, Tim Staton, Brian Salisbury, I don't know if Glenn McClugan is here, and others who took that notion that full citizenship was going to require living in the community and being able to direct your own life and have the legal recognition and agency to do that, and made it real in communities. We learned much from those efforts, as we did from efforts in Ontario. Audrey Cole is here, who helped imagine and who was such a leader in imagining what supported decision-making actually could look like. And what it actually looks like is it respects and recognizes and legally values that interpretive work of families and support network members and sometimes support people. The interpretive work of translating someone's expressions of intention into, and will and preferences, into the basis and foundations of legal capacity. We have to really guard against, and I'm concerned more and more as I look at the proposals for supported decision-making around the world, against this idea that supported decision-making is about supporting people who would otherwise, would be able to act on their own, except they need some assistance in understanding plain language. We've got to provide that support as well, but that wasn't the inspiration for supported decision-making. It was not. It came from families who said, actually, my truth matters. My truth of understanding my own son or daughter and what they want matters, and it has to ground their legal agency. It may not be a cognitive ground of legal agency, and that's our work. We have to establish a non-cognitive ground of legal agency in law. That was the inspiration for supported decision-making, and we have to return to that. And if we create systems for individualized funding that doesn't first do away with that boundary, it will simply be a mechanism that reinforces this in our communities. There will be some, and we've seen it already in direct funding for attendant health services, self-managed direct funding. You've got to meet the criteria for self-management if you're going to get it in the first place. That's not the framework for individualized funding that we're seeking to build. So this effort to challenge the boundary that defines cognitive foreigners in our midst, I think has to be one of our most critical and urgent priorities in the years ahead. And the time is actually running out, right? Because the next 20 years are pretty crucial for us before this demographic transformation that's now upon us comes to full fruition and forecloses, I expect, the democratic spaces in which ourselves, our loved ones, and our communities might rewrite the terms of belonging and inclusion. As we go down this path, there are many allies that we can draw upon. I'm thinking of people like Bruce Jennings, who's a philosopher in the States working with people with dementia and imagines this ground that we're trying to work on as memorial personhood, a group of trusted family and friends who memorialize and help carry the self through those demented, or what some would call the demented self. Or Anita Silvers, who talks about cognitive prosthetics, that what we need to make available to people is simply the cognitive prosthetics. Cognition isn't everything it's racked up to be, and more and more of us are going to be without it in a few years anyway. What we need to imagine is like a prosthetic. Many people use a prosthetic for a limb. Let's give people cognitive prosthetics. Or Yale philosopher that I spoke with about this, Scott Shapiro, talked about planning prosthetics. Will and preferences and as interpreted by family and friends and networks, help communicate a person's desire and intention for a future. So what if people need some planning prosthetics? The work of translating that desire and intention into specific contracts and agreements to give it effect, to make it real in their communities. These kinds of ideas are based, and I really am going to finish. One of the things I think we have to remember is at stake here is how we think about this interpretive work that families and networks and friends and microboards do. What is the nature of this interpretive work? A great German philosopher, Hans Gadamer, wrote in his book called Truth and Method in the 20th century. He said that the act of interpretation is about a truth that is not scientific. Science is never going to get us to these acts, right? That truth is experienced in a context. The truths of interpretation are experienced in the actual context of relationships. One of our challenges is that the truths about people with intellectual disabilities, the truths about people with dementia and with Alzheimer's are produced by positivist scientific clinical accounts of how abnormal and maldeveloped and developmentally delayed a person is. We have to challenge the notion, the idea that our interpretations of a person's will and preference, of parents, of friends and advocates, don't matter, don't have legal standing. Because in legal cases, this is what we're up against. That these are, because it's the scientists and those who have that credibility whose interpretations and assessments count in drawing this boundary between those who are going to be considered cognitively abled and those who are going to be found to be cognitive foreigners. So we have to trust the truths that families who inspired us back in the 70s and 80s and who inspired supported decision-making held. I also urge, finally closing, that as we think through what individualized funding and person-centered planning are over these days and in our gatherings in years to come, that this question always remain present to us. Are our schemes building on foundations that will actually ensure full and equal recognition and access for those whose expression of will and preferences may be in different ways, but who nonetheless have truths to tell that are deserving of equal moral and legal status. Good luck to us all in building these foundations for a non-cognitive ground of legal capacity, personhood, and citizenship so that we can all remain welcome in our communities in the years to come. Thank you.